So, welcome everybody to episode one of Laser Pulse, where we explore the future of light in medicine. And our goals is to bring experts, thought leaders, industry leaders, clinical researchers together to talk about the many uses of lasers in medicine and tell us what we may expect to see in the future. Uh, Today, we're looking at our topic of lasers in medicine, the story so far. And it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Pryor, a friend and mentor for nearly 2 decades, actually. Brian's been instrumental in many aspects of the laser business. And moving forward, as we go to episode two and episode three, Brian will be a co-host. So we felt this was a good opportunity to introduce him to the community at large who may not be familiar with his work. Brian, just kicking off, your bachelor's was in math, right? Mathematics. So
Yeah, my bachelor's degree's in mathematics and chemistry.
mathematics and chemistry, which is just math on steroids, basically. But how did your academic journey get you to lasers? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was always interested in math. Got less interested as it got very, very esoteric, but still liked it. And then in chemistry, the math journey goes in physical chemistry, kind of a cross between physics and chemistry, is pretty much math. So kind of that's where my journey, with loving mathematics and chemistry met. And then my PhD's in physical chemistry, which is a lot of mathematics and quantum mechanics, and lasers are an offshoot of that. And thought that lasers in my journey in graduate school, doing experiments in physical chemistry, a lot of the field is lasers. It's using lasers to probe chemical interactions or quantum phenomena, which is at the heart, mathematical. So that got me, in graduate school, there was no lasers available commercially to do what we wanted to do. So we started doing a lot of work, kind of making our own lasers.
So you were building lasers in school and
Yeah.
and just stuck with them till
Yeah. Yeah. Stuck with them and then looking for a job. I knew I didn't want to be an academic um, pretty quickly. And so, looking at industries, the laser market, back then in the late 90s was, you know, taking off, in many different fields,
right.
medical, telecom. So really the job market was much more available for physical chemists in that field and in computing, right? A lot of physical chemists are on Wall Street trying to correlate markets and using high level math to do financial stuff as well.
Right, right, right. So now your first experience was really on the aesthetic side. Is that fair to say, with a more ablative type of laser using in those aesthetic applications?
Yeah, that was my first. We did other things, some military contracts, um, kind of a lot of different things. I know people would call up and asking us to make really wild stuff, right? It was pretty interesting to hear because we were making custom lasers at the time. So we entertained a lot of different proposals and people doing things. But one thing that we did do is develop some of the first laser hair removal devices. So that was kind of my first foray into medical devices. So we developed Alexandrite lasers to remove hair.
And and so that's where you first started looking at how light interacts with tissue.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's
So
not,
that was kind of the first, and we commercialized, through a partner, we were OEMing that. But we looked at different wavelengths to, pass through the skin and absorb in the hair follicle and different time domains, not to burn the skin, but to burn the hair. And then through our custom work, we did a lot of, made some lasers for tattoo removal, for wrinkles, for laser ultrasound, for breast imaging, so did a lot of different kind of research in tissue, light tissue interaction.
right. And so then that took us up into the early 2000s. And I'm sure that around 2003, 2004, you heard about PBM, but this was getting light into tissue at a much lower, much lower power densities. So can you think back about how you heard about that and what your thoughts were, and then where you went with that?
Yeah, so it was starting to show up like at some of the laser medicine meetings. Many of the dermatologists, aesthetic dermatologists were using, kind of these light panels, not calling it light therapy or not. I don't know why they were using it, but, even now, some of them are, not calling it PBM. It's red light therapy or something else. But it started showing up there in various ways. And a lot of the claims early on, I remember not thinking like, yeah, I'm not getting involved with this. It was a lot of people shining a laser pointer and claiming it was doing a lot. So I shrugged off a lot of the applications, but I really got interested in looking at some of the work, early on and seeing that the cells were responding to the light, right? There was really good work done, really at a fundamental, at a cellular level, like looking at a lot of Winnie Anders, stuff that she does and talking to her probably in 2004, 2005, very interested in some of the work she was doing either in small animals or in Petri dish and saying, well, something's going on here. Where if it does work, right, for pain, inflammation, it's a pretty interesting market. And so that's why kind of combining my expertise in getting light into tissue, right, looking at which wavelengths can penetrate, but also which wavelengths have this cellular effect is really what inspired us to, start LiteCure and look at applications with much higher powers than people were looking at. So
Yeah.
still not ablative, right? We were, if you take 10 watts and focus it, then it's going to be ablative. But using 10 watts and blowing it up to a big spot, now, the power density, still higher than some of the things people were doing, but um, not high enough to have an ablative effect or even a thermal effect.
It's funny you mentioned Professor Anders. We hope to have her on the podcast at some point in the future. I think she would be an excellent guest. And I guess you're talking about 2006, 2007, when the thought of shining 10 watts onto the skin, no matter how big a spot size, was considered in many circles heresy, right? You were going to, I remember hearing the phrase, you're going to denature protein. You're basically going to, whatever that means, you're going to kill people. So I think you were really a pioneer at that time in saying we need 10 watts on the skin here, people, to start eliciting a response in a reasonable treatment time. I know that very early on you started in veterinary medicine. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that LiteCure journey?
Yeah, so when we started LiteCure in late 2006, I think we registered the company in like November of 2006. And then, kind of getting our first product in early 2007, submitting an FDA, 510K. And while waiting for 510K and looking at human markets, we were looking at veterinarian applications. And I think, a little bit we stumbled into it. We thought, well, let's sell into equine market, right? Horses, they use a lot of stuff on horses. They see the effect because they could win. It'll be perfect for us. Um, and in 2007, the economy was not going in the right direction. And a lot of the horsing industry took a big hit. It's kind of a luxury item, and then horse owners. So not the greatest plan, but it did translate over to small animal veterinarians, right? Treating dogs and cats, which is a good market, was a good market then as the economy is kind of going the wrong way. People are still going to care for their pets. It's a, I don't know, truly recession-proof industry, but it's one that's, you know, better than others. And
Yeah.
then at the time, instead of doing surgery or, spending a lot of money on meds, I think laser therapy had the advantage that we could price it correctly, that wasn't going to break the bank for pet owners. It's pretty expensive for veterinarians to get in the game, but they could show a reasonable return charging, $50, $60 a treatment, and so maybe a whole, series of 6 to 8 treatments is going to cost you a couple $100. Whereas, TPLO surgery or massive surgery is going to cost you thousands of dollars. So I think we were fortunate that, the timing really worked out and veterinarians were open, to
Right.
trying something new. I love working with the vet community. They're open, they're smart, right? They're willing to, they're cautious, but willing, right?
Yeah.
So it's a good test market. And if it's going to work there, then you could have some hope that it's going to work in human medicine, because they're not going to do stuff to their animals that doesn't work, right? They're not
Yeah.
going to scam. They're very scientific. They want to see good studies. So we're very fortunate enough to have those relationships.
And it has to, in some way, validate moving to the human market because there's a much lower placebo response, right? You can't talk a spaniel into feeling better. And I think early on, the vets saw good results, right? They saw physical change before there was good studies on the higher powers. And there was a lot of anecdotes to say that this is doing something to these animals that is positive.
Yeah, I mean, we had, right, penguins that we treated that, you can see them wobble different. We used to use that a lot. And some exotic animals, snakes with, degenerative problems that were moving differently after laser therapy. So, and we did a lot of different experiments and treating different animals. I still today, when I give a talk, show, the arthritis study that we did on client-owned dogs, right? So it was a canine study that was placebo controlled. There was two groups, and owners were told that they could tailor the amount of NSAIDs they're giving to the dog to their pets based on results, right? And so they showed that out of the laser treated dogs, all of them reduced the meds, and in the placebo group, none of them reduced the meds. I mean, that's a pretty telling study.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The dogs
Black
have
and
no
white.
idea whether they were treated or not. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, no, that's but that came sometime afterwards, right? That
yeah.
the actual literature started to support what the anecdotes were tending to show. And so as you move in parallel, uh, like so many things, particularly in rehab, it's a trickle down from elite sports often, right? It's used on elite athletes in a very rarefied atmosphere at first, and then trickles down. And was that somewhat your experience here as you after the 510K? And could you just discuss some of the athletes or sports teams that you interacted with?
Yeah, so I think we learned that a little bit fortuitously too, right? Stumbled in. I didn't want, salespeople banging on pro sports teams and thinking they're going to want everything and, hard to get and not a huge market, right? An overall scheme, it's not. But that's a wrong effect. We did really well early on. Right. I think we met through someone we met early on, right? A chiropractor in New Jersey, Phil Santiago. We met him through Ed Ryan, who was, medical director of the Olympics, met at a show, who are open, right? They were open. They were asking good questions, very scientific, and fortunate that, they wanted to work with us and, try it. And that parlayed us into working with the Celtics and Ed Lasert. He was the trainer of the Celtics for a long time. And he integrated it into their training room. And then it kind of snowballed. It is once you're in that community, it's a tight-knit community. They want to share what they're doing. They're also cautious, like veterinarians. They want to share, but they want to share stuff that actually they're seeing results with.
Right.
So, I think our first baseball team was the Blue Jays. George Poulos was there as their head trainer. Now he's with Atlanta. George became a good friend, right? Seeing great results. And it kind of snowballed from there getting into, but I think baseball and basketball were the earliest that we got into. And then hockey and basketball, NFL followed pretty quickly. And then sports, and it is a pretty sizable market when you drill all the way down. That we even had some high schools, right? There's some elite high
Right.
schools that
Yeah.
have products that are using it. So yeah, it was a very good market, and they see results, right? And the athletes know their bodies really, really well. So when they see, I think a lot of things start in sports, not a lot of things stick.
Right, right.
And so that's something that has stuck, right, since probably 2007, 2008, that we were in sports and, all the teams now, it's kind of a common modality that they're using in the locker room all these years later. So it's definitely, has longevity, which tells you a lot.
And I have heard you take full credit for the Celtics 2008 championship win. I believe that they used it during the game on a couple of key players.
Yeah, maybe. We don't know. There was injuries during the game and they came out and continued the game. So, and their laser was in the training room. Um,
Kevin Garnett went in, limped into the training room,
yeah,
came
not
out.
Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Paul
Paul
Pierce.
Pierce and Kevin Garnett were treated, I think.
There,
But,
yeah, that Celtics team had a lot of injuries and they won, so maybe the laser helped a bit.
and they did send you a signed ball.
They did.
So, so yeah. So that's
I think
kind
a bigger testament to Ed Lasserp being a
of,
really good trainer.
I think that's probably very fair. So on that same journey, as well as with the elite sports team, you've also worked with some really interesting researchers, because I think that one of the hallmarks of LiteCure, through being founded and run by a scientist rather than an accountant or a salesperson or more of a business person, was that your heart and direction were in good scientific evidence, evidence-based medicine, getting good quality studies published, seeing things in decent journals to corroborate the marketing story. Do you want to talk about some of those collaborations in the research community, in the academic community?
Yeah, so I think that's important, right? That you lead with studies. You have to balance it, right? That's the hard thing with new innovative technologies that you have, you know, bills to pay, right? You have investors to satisfy. Um, but you also have to have good science because it's not going to stay around. Innovation's not going to stick if it doesn't work. So you really have to balance that. And I think, you and I have traveled around the world talking to many scientists at, esteemed universities and, leading by science, you have the respect and you want it to work, right? So we're going to do what it takes. If they're not convinced, and what do they want to see, right? So ultimately, it does help in the sales and marketing because you have the studies to show. So
Right,
at the end of the day, every clinician wants to see science. Some put more value on others. So I think it was really critical working, from the early stage, right? Doing the work with Juanita, Anders and Petri dish on nerves, all the way up to doing clinical trials with veterinarians. We did depth of penetration studies in the spine of dogs with Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma State University. Um, so yeah, so it really kind of runs the gamut to do, studies on all different creatures and, different body parts, right? We've done a lot of anatomy studies looking at how light gets into different joints on different skin colors. So yeah, there's a lot that we've done and, built the knowledge base.
right. And I think there's also that work's driven the design process too,
Yeah, yeah, 100%, right? So that's, I think, a big thing is you just don't put wavelengths in for the sake of putting wavelengths in.
or
Like we
more
could build
power.
any wavelength. Yeah, or more power or more pulsing or whatever, right? The science has to lead. We, as a laser manufacturer, can make any. It's not hard. Eh, Maybe it's not impossible to make every wavelength. Some are harder than others, but pretty much today, you can make or buy lasers that have, cover the span of wavelengths. It's what has the evidence to work, right? And why the power level, and then how does it fit in economically or in the workflow? I think that's a big thing also in innovation that a lot of people skip over. Like, oh, I have this great innovation. If it's just going to disrupt the workflow in a negative way of your customer, they're never going to adapt it,
Right,
right? It's got
right.
to fit into the workflow. And that's critical with product design as well as what the outcomes are.
Yeah, yeah. So the Like Your journey, despite coming through a recession, was a demonstrable success as it was snapped up by, I think, the fourth or fifth largest orthopedic company in the world, right? Back in 2020, at the end of 2020. And you've continued to innovate and look at exciting, I think, and entrepreneurial applications for PBM. Do you want to talk about a little bit about where that work is now, looking at things outside of musculoskeletal applications?
Yeah, so a couple of, ventures that we've started, some of them previous to the LiteCure exit, some of them afterwards. One is in, pelvic floor pain. So with a urogynecologist, I started a company, Sean Wang and I, who are partners in a lot of different ventures. Sean's a very brilliant scientist as well, and entrepreneur. We started a company with Dr. Zipper from Florida, and he saw the LiteCure devices, saw the musculoskeletal, and we became friends, like looking at different applications and develop an intravaginal probe to treat pelvic floor pain. So we did a lot of studies with a sheep model to look at where the light goes and to make sure we have dosing that gets to the appropriate pelvic floor muscles that are affected during pelvic floor pain. So we've launched that company. The company's called EuroShape. The product is Sola Pelvic Therapy. It's started a randomized controlled trial at the end of last year. So we hope to finish that this year. It's going to be, 140-ish patients, double-blinded, placebo-controlled. So it'll really move the field ahead. I think, seeing good results previous to the start, right? Doing the studies that we did, we saw great results. And so we anticipate that the double-blind placebo control will show, you know, very effectiveness on treating pelvic floor pain and a huge problem, right? It's a
Right.
massive
Well, isn't it
problem.
interesting that all that work with musculoskeletal applications and that never came up on the radar, and yet it seems to be a massive problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, physical therapy is starting to get involved, right? I think it's the fastest growing specialty in physical therapy, because they could do things like, use, biofeedback or, other exercises, strengthening to help with pelvic floor. That's not the market that Sola is going after. This will really be driven by urogynecologists or, gynecologic surgeons. It's a non-invasive approach, but they're kind of the front line of pelvic floor pain.
Right,
And
right,
so
right.
that's who we're doing the studies with. But it's growing, I think, as more, there's nothing for it. That's another problem that people don't talk about it. There's not much you could do for it. And so as applications, as technologies come about, then I think people will talk about it more. Um, once you're in that community, then you learn about it really quick that it affects a lot of women every time. But yeah, before I didn't even realize it was on the map. And now
Right,
when I go to a party or go to an event and tell people what I'm doing, someone's talking to me about, they have it or their wife has it or a friend has it. It's like 1 in 3 women are affected by, chronic pelvic floor pain at some part of their life. So it's
right.
a big problem.
Yeah, and there's multi-diagnoses, right? It's yeah, as it was described by Dr. Zipper, it's the fire, it's not the flame, right? It's not the
Yeah.
spark. That could be one of many different things. Endometriosis or interstitial cystitis or a whole menu of things, but the pelvic pain is tight muscles, which is exactly the same as you've been treating in the football players, in the in the athletic dogs. It's the same process, right? So
Yeah, yeah, 100%. So it's exciting. I'm very excited about that entity, and it has a lot of potential, and will bring a lot of pain relief, to patients. And
well,
then another entity we have is called Neurothera. So that device is for putting lasers on the brain. Um, you can get light into the brain through the skull. It's been shown many different ways. You can't get a lot of light through. The good news is you don't need a lot of light. So we're doing studies right now at Harvard, NYU, and in Peru on major depressive disorder, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's.
and now that's uh, a complete breakaway from musculoskeletal. Right? I could see how the pelvic floor pain was kind of a natural extension. But is this a similar mechanism, or what's going on here with Parkinson's or with Alzheimer's and laser?
Yeah, I think we still have a lot to learn. We got interested because, Luis de Taboada, who will hopefully be another one of our guests, right? He's another pioneer in photobiomodulation. So he worked with a company called Photothera, and they did a pretty large trial on stroke. So they did, I don't know, many hundred patient stroke trial. And at the end of the day, it didn't meet its primary endpoint. And a lot of that comes from they just expanded the inclusion criteria. It's difficult in any study to recruit patients, and in stroke, it's even harder when you're, behind many, drug companies doing studies. So I don't think the technology was a failure. I think maybe, just opening up the criterion of the study, trying to go too fast. But they spent a lot of money, with the technology, with the science, showing that how much light can you get into the brain in different areas. So we were fortunate enough, we were able to buy, their whole portfolio of intellectual property. So, our company has, 40-ish patents on putting light on the brain. So, we built around that. Um, Again, it's the science, lead with the science. So it's frustrating, but it's necessary that you have to do these studies. They take a long time. So we'll see what the outcomes are. Many of them are blinded. We do have good, you know, preliminary results on, major depressive disorder. So that's the one I put the most hope in first because of its frontal lobe. So we know where to put the light. We don't have to worry too much about the effects of hair, right? Because you have things inside. So we know we can get light in there. And the preliminary results look promising. So that's kind of the first. And the mechanism, yeah, it's a tough one, right? So it could be the fact that we're increasing blood flow to the brain. We've shown that. We've done some FNAIRS, measurements with light and without light, showing that we have increased blood flow. We have done a dosing study that we can show one particular dose does increase the blood flow in the whole brain when you treat frontal lobe. So that is encouraging, to use that same kind of dosing for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's because maybe this global blood flow is the mechanism. But I think that's what we'll learn.
Right,
That's what, and for Parkinson's, Parkinson's is a deep brain disease. We're not getting light to the source of the problem. We're hoping that we could kind of have a positive effect on motor control. So
right.
less tremors, right? Better quality of life, better movement. So that's kind of the goal with Parkinson's.
Manage the fire,
Depression,
not the match.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so it's hopeful, right? It's we're doing some PET studies. We'll look at energetics of the brain. So those results will be out very soon. So seeing is there a change in the metabolism of brain cells? No one's done that, and this could be a positive, result showing that, with the light on you are, and with the light off you're not. Like so, that's what we're hoping to show in some of the studies that'll come out, this year.
That would be a great pointer for exactly what is happening, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So for years, just being in this world, you hear sometimes on TV or in a magazine about PDT. It's the next great thing for cancer. It's going to, remove all these terrible side effects of chemo and everything. And I know that you've been involved in PDT. Do you want to just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so PDT, right, is photodynamic therapy. It basically takes a drug, right, a photoactive, photosensitized drug. It selectively attaches to cancer cells, and via the light, it quenches the oxygen out. So the light kind of interacts with the chemical, quenches the oxygen out of the cell, and kills the cell. So that's kind of the mechanism behind photodynamic therapy. And there's been a couple of commercial drugs for PDT for some skin cancers. For eye disease, there's one that's approved. Um, it's a long process, right? And it costs a lot of money. So I think that that's part of PDT's maybe slow adoption rate. Like, what's the killer app for PDT?
Right.
Because it costs a tremendous amount to do cancer studies because it's a drug, right? It's a drug light combination. So the light's kind of not the hard part. I think another thing that set it back is now you have these drugs that are maybe approved for an orphan cancer or something where you don't have a lot of patients. Can you afford to buy, as a clinician, afford to buy a $30,000 laser to treat,
Right.
a handful of patients? The economics, may not work out. So that's why I think at LiteCure, right, in the companion side of the business, we had an agreement, they still do, right, with a company called Nanospectra in Houston that it's PTT, so photothermal therapy. So it's a gold nanoparticle that attaches to selectively accumulates in cancer. And then they can selectively heat the tumor through these gold nanoparticles.
And they're not a drug.
It's not a drug, it's a device still going through the FDA process. So, jury's still out, but no, in principle, it's not a drug because it's a gold inert nanoparticle.
Mhm.
And then so Companion is starting to commercialize, you know, and my thought was around bringing that to market. Well, now we have, thousands of veterinarians with the laser are in their hands, right? So they
Right.
don't have to make this investment, of $30,000. They already made that investment and they're using the laser for light therapy for PBM. So now if they have the nanoshells, then they could start treating cancer with the same laser, maybe with a different attachment, right? There is a little bit of difference, but in principle, they
Right.
bought the engine already.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
changing how they deliver it. So I have a lot of hope for that. And again, maybe veterinary medicine can lead the way, right? Just like a lot of PBM, I'm sure you see the same thing I see. You're on a plane and start talking to people, what do you do? And they're like, oh my God, my dog got lasered, right?
Yeah. Right.
That happens way more times than them getting lasered.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that, I'm hopeful that some of these therapies, starting out in vet can really kind of teach the public and drive the medical use.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we're wrapping up here, Brian, what would you like people to understand about red light, lasers, PBM? If there was a takeaway from this talk, what would make you happy?
Yeah, I think, ask your doctor about it, right? Demand it, right? When patients demand it, it works better. But I think science is the key, right? I think for doctors, for scientists, for companies, that you get inundated, right? Just listening to this, you're probably going to get 100 ads from social media on red light. Like maybe, I search a lot for light, so maybe I'm predisposed, but it seems like every day there's a new company, there's another light pad or light this, light that. And, there's very little science, right? They're kind of hand waving to some of the stuff that we did with high powers. It's not the same. And if you look down the bottom, it always says, not a medical device, right? There's always a caveat.
Right.
So it's important for people to recognize you could sell anything if you don't make claims. And then some people are walking that line of claims, right? It's wellness or it's going to
Yeah.
make you feel better. Or the FDA doesn't really mandate on making you feel better.
Enhances something.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that reading that on people's website, is this really an approved device or not an approved device? And maybe some of them do well. I'm not saying they don't, but prove it with science,
Right.
and good science, just like a lot of things, whether you're laying in a hyperbaric chamber or laying in a light bed or laying whatever, I tell people it has to be placebo controlled because if you take my phone away and I could lay in a bed for 20 minutes, I don't care if there's light or anything, I'm going to feel better,
Yeah. Right. And you'll
right?
report
Just,
it. You'll
yeah,
report
if
it
I,
on a VAS scale.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that it has to be, done well, placebo controlled, what are the outcomes people are looking for? And then like I think it has stickiness, right? Then people will use it. Then, it'll become a medical mainstream. I think the risk really is, people flooding the market. That's the big risk I have with Neurotherapy, right? You see all these devices out there, helmets for everything, people promising and whatever. Well, if you scare people, they're going to buy it if the price is right. So if you get all these light helmets promising Alzheimer's or whatever they're promising, and it doesn't have an effect, when our studies come out, when we find a dose that may be effective, people are going to say, "Oh yeah, I used light therapy years ago. It didn't work."
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We battled that, in the early days of LiteCure. We had a lot is like, "Oh yeah, we tried light therapy,
Yeah.
years ago. we tried cold laser, we tried low level laser, and it
Right.
worked pretty good for some wounds, but yeah, it didn't really stick.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
we had to overcome kind of, good thing it wasn't as prominent, as some of the stuff is now.
Mhm.
It was only a few, I think that's why veterinarians kind of gravitated. They weren't inundated with that,
Right.
like chiropractors or some physical therapist early on were kind of exposed a lot more with the, you know, cold
Yeah.
laser stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very fair observation and very astute. Buyer beware, I guess, is the takeaway.
Yeah.
Um, in your crystal ball, we're on laser focus in 5 years. The podcast has just started. What are we talking about?
Yeah, hopefully we're talking about, I think everyday usage, right,
Okay.
of
Yeah.
light therapy and I think like aesthetics, right? In the aesthetic world, in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, all the aesthetic laser companies were going to these laser conferences, right? And then by 2003, they were going to dermatology meetings, right? They were focused on an application. They became laser companies to aesthetic laser companies. And I think the same thing here is, you'll have laser companies that are, neuro, right? Neuro focused. You
Right. Right.
have women's health focus, and that's what we're starting, right? Is to go down these verticals because you really have to stay focused on the problem,
Yeah.
right? Stay focused on the problem. Don't try to solve every problem because it might be way different, right? The delivery mechanism is different. Again, the doctor's habits, the insurance codes, all this stuff takes a focused team, of business development, of sales to really go after it. So I think you'll see a lot more, light therapy companies, but I think they'll be heads down in certain verticals,
Right.
and I think you will see in 5 years, people using it, in women's health for many different applications. I think that women's health is an open market that, to even surgical, right, to deal
Right.
with some, um, and then in the brain, of course, it's exciting. Maybe 5 years maybe it takes longer for the
Right.
brain in 5 years. So hopefully not, but, it's complicated. The brain is complicated in 5 years, but I do think I think that the regular PBM for musculoskeletal will be, more every day. It's almost there, right?
Yeah.
I think the LiteCure, the last we checked, with some of the data that they have are installed placements, but, treating probably coming up on 2 million treatments a month, right? So it's not mainstream yet. There's a lot more physical therapy visits than that, but it's getting out there, right? There's a lot. It's almost becoming standard of care in physical medicine.
Right. 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 But 5 years isn't a long time if your criteria is be driven by the science, right? Because
Right.
studies take a long
Studies take
time,
a
they're
long time.
expensive, it's
Yeah.
requires
And
it's
I
a
think
heavy lift.
investment will lead a lot of that, right? I think that's another key point is that, the investment in biotech, especially in medical devices for the last couple of years has not been high,
Right.
right? It's really been a very slow market for investment. And hopefully this year that picks up. But I think as the investment picks up, right, the investment in photomedicine, right, and that's another where good science because investors aren't going to put their money to
Right.
support things that aren't good science, right? That's the last thing they want to do. They want something that has a path to success with big markets. And so I think you'll see that. I think with the LiteCure acquisition, we're seeing, a lot more, um, you know, interest in light therapy because once you have acquisitions, then there's hopefully more to come. So, but I think investment will spur a lot of this on. So the key, I think, is to grow good companies, right? Get investment, and then it'll lead to that. There's Lumathera is another PBM company that's doing, basically PBM for macular degeneration. Um, they have approval in Europe, I believe. They're close in the US, or they might have in the US, but they raise money, significant money from investors. So things like that, more of those type of investment,
Right.
deals that are closing more, ABC rounds of venture capital, then I think the money will be there to do the studies and then get commercial. So
Yeah.
probably in 5 years, I think my hope is that you'll see a lot more talk with investors doing more investments in kind of laser medicine.
And perhaps more specialized companies just focusing on one condition or one area and
Yeah, and that's what investors want to see, right? They want it's got to be a pretty clear story, to get an investment.
so what the question we ask all, well, we're going to ask all our guests is what brings you joy?
Uh, yeah, I think it must be doing all these companies, right? Because I do it continually to do it. So, um, when I look back, thought I would slow down a bit, and now I have more going on than ever. So it must bring me joy by default. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. Also, family brings me joy, right? That's ultimate joy. And I think that, doing these companies with a purpose in medicine, it's easy. It's easy to get out of bed when you know the end game, you know, win, lose, or draw. The end game is making a difference to medicine,
Right,
right?
right.
Even
Getting
if the
people out
studies
of
don't
pain.
work. Yeah. Even if the studies don't work, you're putting something out there. Okay, don't try this, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
you are promoting, the science going ahead, whether you win or you lose. I think you have to publish that. So it's too big for, one company. It's too big for any one person, right? I think there has to be more collaboration in this space, um, because there's room for a lot, right?
yeah.
There's room for a lot of companies in many of these spaces. So collaboration, I think, will be good. But yeah, that brings me joy is seeing companies grow, right? It was really fun watching LiteCure grow. Um, we still have great friends, great memories. So doing that again a few more times, would be fun. There's pains, don't get me wrong. But I think seeing companies grow in the medical device space is really, yeah, that brings me joy.
Good, excellent. Well, I think, Brian, I'm sure listeners have found this really interesting. I think the key takeaways that this is a very young modality, right? I mean, you're talking about something that got FDA clearance in 2002, 2003. I mean, compared to other things, it's been a rocket ship, really, in terms of growth. It's still very young. The evolution is getting very exciting, moving away from my back hurts, my shoulder hurts, into some really, really interesting areas. There's no bigger problems really, Alzheimer's, depression. I mean, this and depression is a bedfellow of pain. So it's all linked, right? So I think that's one of the takeaways. And like Edison did, learn from the 10,000 light bulbs that didn't work, right? It's okay to fail as long as you're trying because you're helping others not try that, right? So, but
Yeah.
the key takeaway I would say is be driven by the science. Don't just let marketing hype guide your product development, your promotion, your marketing, your targeting. It's a science led. If it's going to be successful, it's going to be a science led. It's going to be a science led modality. Is there any closing thoughts you want to share? Because I think we're just about done.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a good podcast. I'm looking forward to, bringing on guests in different laser applications, right? I think we'll have a bias a little bit about, PBM. But, we're going to try to bring in, people using it from ablative to diagnostics, right? There's a lot of diagnostic applications for
Yeah.
lasers as well. So, and I think, in the audience, if you have a guest or have a topic that, you want to suggest us, write to us, because we want to make this kind of inclusive to the laser application community and, thinking outside the box as well as doing some more mainstream things. So I'm looking forward to hosting with you, Andy. We always
Yeah.
have fun and we have a lot of adventures and
Yeah.
a lot of laser stories together. So it'll be fun kind of hosting together and inviting some, different key opinion leaders in the fields
Yeah.
of laser medicine to share with.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to it. I mean, yes, we have PBM in our DNA. but we're going to try and keep it as non-denominational as we can because we're just interested in hearing what other people who are playing with light in interesting and exciting, innovative ways. We want them to be able to share their story. So, as Brian said, if anybody has a speaker they would like to propose or a topic or any questions, you can. The correspondence all goes through info at AIMLA, AIMLA .org. This podcast is put out under AIMLA, which is American Institute of Medical Laser Applications, an online source for safety and application training. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks so much.